Let's talk about all the ways in which assumptions show up in our conversations, our relationships, and our fights. Since I've been making assumptions and paying the price for them for years now, I'll share my stories as examples of what not to do and offer some alternative approaches. You should be warned, though, I talk about some tough topics, and some of that might be triggering for you. Because to me, I don't think it's acceptable to not talk about this stuff. Oh, I'm also a little cussy. Please take care of yourself as you listen. Make yourself comfortable, grab a snack and a drink, and let's get started. Welcome back to Confessions of a Chronic Assumer. I'm your host, Ellen Patnode, and I am, in fact, a chronic assumer. Today is the first of two episodes where we're going to be talking about assumptions and boundaries. And today, we're going to talk about how assumptions affect how we draw lines between our public relationships and our private relationships. And that doesn't always break down neatly between your home life and your work life. There are lots of people that we encounter that fall into sort of a gray area. So it's helpful to think about ways that we distinguish the expectations that we have of every relationship that we're in. So here's a few questions to consider and some that we're going to try to answer in today's episode. One is, how worried are you about whether or not people like you? And this would be people outside of like your core nuclear family that you live with, the people that you're closest to, your closest circle of friends, not your endless list of 743 Facebook friends, but your close people, your tribe, your inner circle. How worried are you about people that are outside of that small circle? How worried are you about whether or not they like you? Another question to consider is, how does that impact how you show up in those relationships? Again, these are the ones outside of that inner circle. Has wanting to be liked or fearing being disliked ever influenced your behavior? If it hasn't, you're not human, because it happens to all of us. However, how often does it happen? That can be an interesting thing to take notice of. So what is it that happens when we're in these situations? What assumptions are happening inside of our heads? What stories are we telling ourselves about what we are allowed or supposed to think or feel or say or do? And then how do we overcome those assumptions and set better boundaries in those relationships, which often looks like clarifying what expectations we have of those relationships? So let me share a couple of examples with you. So back in 2021, I was starting to write the book that is one of the themes of this show, the I Thought You Knew, Confessions of a Chronic Assumer book. It was an idea at that point. And when I started working on it, I contracted a developmental editor to help me through the process. So a developmental editor is somebody that can work with you while you're writing a story. They can give you input and feedback about how the story is taking shape, etc. So that's a person that tends to know a lot about you, a lot about your story. And in my case, I was writing a book that was filled with stories and examples of ways that I'd gotten all of this stuff quite wrong in my life. So, some level of vulnerability there. But it was a professional contracted relationship. Well, I was very impressed with her resume. I was very impressed with her at the beginning of the process. She'd come highly recommended from someone that I trusted. And so in the beginning, when, a few weeks into our working relationship, she started using terms of endearment, which I was mildly uncomfortable with, but I thought, it's whatever. She was a little bit older than me. I thought, it's some people are just like that. It's no big deal, whatever. I'm not feeling threatened. But then she started sharing inappropriate information with me. There were some stories that I was sharing in the original writing of this book that involved a lot of vulnerability. And she had a similar life experience to part of my story. And so she kept putting herself into the story. She was sharing inappropriate details about things that she had gone through, which really didn't have any bearing on the book that I was trying to write. So there started to be these little red flags that were popping up. And then I sent her an email on a Sunday night because I was going to be unavailable for the next 3 days. I was on site with a client and I was going to have very full days and I knew I wouldn't be available to be in contact. So I sent her an email. What I should have done was schedule that email to go out at 8 o'clock the next morning. I didn't think about it. I sent the email and, 30 seconds later, I get a text message from her asking if I was free to talk. Knowing I would be unavailable for the next 3 days, I assumed what she wanted to discuss was the book. And so I said, sure, I have a little bit of time. I was in a hotel room. So she called me and started unloading about her life on me. And I don't know if it was because it was a Sunday and she felt like maybe we're outside of normal working hours or what the deal was that made her think that that was okay. But I sat listening, feeling extremely uncomfortable about the conversation. She ended that by telling me all of these hardships that she was going through at the moment and asked if I would mind paying the next installment of our working relationship together up front. I did not feel like I could say no, and her editing feedback was quite helpful. And so I thought, okay, that's not standard practice, FYI. But I trust her. We've been working together for a couple of months now. It's probably fine, right? It wasn't fine. Here are the assumptions I was making in that moment. I was assuming that I could not push back or speak up for myself because that would mean I was being heartless or cold if I didn't comply with her wishes. She had just shared all this difficult stuff she was going through. So it put me in this position of assuming that if I was to push back and say, I'm not really comfortable with that, or this is a little bit too much that you're sharing with me, that I was going to make things really awkward in our working relationship. And in that moment, my headspace was such that I felt like I needed to agree to the terms because I needed to make sure she continued to like me and want to work with me. I also was making an assumption that she was the only developmental editor out there who was any good, which is, let me tell you for a fact, completely untrue. And so I found myself kind of backed into a corner. Well, the outcome of that is that I lost money. She was on a path to having a mental health crisis. It came to a head. She went off the rails and off the grid for several months. And in spite of my attempts to follow up and get my money back for services she never rendered, I've been unable to do so. So I lost money. I lost faith in my own judgment also for a period of time as a consequence of that experience. A story that's a little more centered in a traditional workplace would be there was a manager I was coaching over the course of a couple of years who had an employee on her team, a team member, who was brand new to the organization. She was figuring out culture. She was trying to figure out how to be effective in the workplace. But she was a little bit slow to learn a few things. She made a couple of mistakes, and the manager was telling me in one of our coaching sessions about some of the mistakes that she was making. And through our conversation, I was kind of my assumption was that she would want to help this employee learn the proper way to do things, that she would want to invest in her and correct her, give her the feedback so she would know what she was doing wrong and what she needed to change. But this manager was like, oh, no, no. If I give her that kind of feedback, I'm going to hurt her feelings. She might cry. I really don't want to do that. You know what? It's just easier if I do it myself. I've heard that from more managers than I care to count, by the way, side note. So the assumptions that this manager was making were that, first of all, that the team member couldn't handle feedback, And that was coming from the fact that this manager couldn't handle feedback. So she was projecting her own assumption. We're going to talk about that in a later episode. She was projecting her own feelings about how she might respond if she received what she perceived to be difficult feedback or corrective feedback. And so she didn't want to hurt her feelings. There was also an assumption that what was most important was that this team member like the manager, that being liked really was the most important thing. It trumped everything else. It really was more important than investing in this team member to show her how to do the job correctly. So the outcome there was that the manager ended up doing the team member's job for her. The other consequence was that the team member did not learn and grow. And she continued to make some of the same mistakes. She continued to not perform up to the level that she really was capable of because the manager wasn't investing in her to help her understand and give her some tough feedback because that manager was more invested in making sure the team member liked her. So, our blind spots are maintained when we operate that way. We deprive ourselves and the people around us an opportunity to really learn and grow from what's happening. One more example. This one hits really close to home because it's about my home life. And at this particular moment, life in my house is challenging. There's a lot going on. There's a lot happening. As you know by now, if you've watched any of the previous episodes, I have no problem speaking my mind. And I tend to share pretty freely what my opinions are. And, our home life, our private life is the place where we're supposed to be able to just show up with our whole, full, authentic self. We don't have to filter. We don't have to put on airs. We can just show up and truly, authentically be who we are. And in my case, that sometimes results in me speaking my mind before I've really stopped to think about how it's going to come out. But I also, I know that I'm not everybody's shot of whiskey or cup of tea, whatever expression you prefer. I know that about myself. I say that often. But at home, I have the expectation of those private life relationships that they are going to love me unconditionally, that they're going to accept me exactly who I am, and that they are going to be just as invested in having peace and harmony in our household as I am. The problem comes into play when I don't stop and think ahead of time, and I go ahead and freely speak my mind, and I come off a little bit aggressively, if you will. And then I get that pushback from my wife or from my kids, and it's heartbreaking because I'm in my private life. My expectation is that they love me and they like me and that there's going to be peace and harmony in our house. I don't have the expectation from my private relationships that they're going to push back and challenge me and that level of like professional agitation that we tolerate from our coworkers. I don't want that from my wife and kids. Of course, I want them to call me out, but it's different. It's different in our private relationships than it is in our public ones. So there are some assumptions that take place in my head during that. And there's some contradictory ones. And I'm, like I said before, I'm in the middle of this right now. So it is not a fully resolved situation. And those competing assumptions are definitely at work. So on the one hand, I start feeling like, well, I guess I just shouldn't speak my mind. I guess I shouldn't say what I really think. I guess I should be less honest or just keep my mouth shut, which, if you remember back to the first episode when I was introducing myself, I went on at length about how that message had been drilled into me when I was young. So I should just go live in a cave because they're mad at me and they don't like me, and I should just be quiet. There's also this opposite assumption that my home is the place for peace and harmony, and I don't want to be challenged there, which is just silly. Of course, I'm going to be challenged, but it's different. It's different when we're at home. Again, the outcome on this one, I don't have a clear answer because I'm still struggling through it, to be very honest with you. But so far, the outcome is that I end up sometimes feeling like they don't like me very much. And because that's really important to me in my private life, I feel like an outcast. I sometimes feel like, well, maybe I should just go live in a cave and everybody would be better off without me around all the time if I'm so offensive and intimidating and upsetting and all that other crap. Um, so I just end up having a gigantic pity party and really feeling sorry for myself, which does not position me to lean in. It doesn't position me to engage in a way that could actually help bring resolution to the situation. It causes me to lean away, and that's not helpful. What I really need to do is engage, even when I want to tell everybody to fuck off. For the record, I don't ever say to my family, fuck off, but I feel it and I think it sometimes. Anyway, so what's happening in these moments? What's happening in these moments when we are caught up in these assumptions and we're like subconsciously navigating what our expectations are in these relationships, public versus private? We're fighting against stories that some of us have been hearing all our lives about what we're allowed to do or say or think or feel. Sometimes those stories are so deeply ingrained, we're not even aware that we're telling ourselves those stories, and we are not aware of how they impact us. We end up arguing against ourselves because we can't step away enough to understand we're the ones getting in our own way. The other thing that's happening is that we're much more focused on what the other person might think about us rather than being focused on controlling what we can actually control, which is our own shit. We can control how we decide to show up with other people, how to engage with them, whether we lean in or lean away. We're in control of those things. What we're not in control of is how they respond or react. But we can decide that we want to have appropriate expectations from those relationships. So in a public relationship, we can make the decision. We control how we approach them. So we can decide that we don't want to have the expectation that people are going to like us. We want the expectation that they're going to respect us and that there is a healthy balance of that relationship. It's not personal. If they like us, that's like sort of an ancillary benefit, but it's dangerous when it's the goal. We're also putting inappropriate expectations onto other people. We get so much more focused on being liked rather than being respected. Or in the case of my home life, we're expecting harmony when really we need to be open to those healthy challenges. So what can we do about it? I already mentioned those circles of control. We have to remember what's inside of our circle of control includes what we say, what we think, what we feel, what we do, what our attitude is. Those are the things that are within our control. We do not control any of those things as they apply to other people. So we can't control what other people think or do or say or feel, nor should we try, because what's the fun in that? The other thing we can do is, rather than worrying about how much information people know about you, think about what the expectations are that you have from that relationship. Again, oftentimes what I hear from people that I work with professionally is, well, I don't want to share my story because if they know that about me, they're going to use it against me. They probably won't use it against you, but regardless, worrying about how much information people know about you versus what is your expectation of how they're going to use that information, or what's your expectation from the relationship, that's a much better place to put your energy. So think about if you expect them to like you, do you expect them to challenge you? Do you expect them to just keep peace and harmony at all cost at the expense of you keeping your blinders on? Right? What are the expectations? And then, finally, get comfortable with not being everybody's cup of tea. It's overrated. That can suck when it's happening at home. As I shared, it's an uncomfortable place at the moment because we're moving through some shit together. But it is essential in your public relationships. If you do not draw that boundary of expecting people to respect you and engage with you based on common self-interest and respect versus whether they like you or not and just want to make you happy and please you, that is a very dangerous path for you to walk. Thanks for joining me today. Come back next time. We're going to do part 2 of the assumptions and boundaries conversation. And this time we're going to specifically focus on ways in which we push back. Until then, please connect with me on social media. You can find me on LinkedIn at Ellen Patnode. You can find me on Facebook and Instagram at Patnode Coaching. And remember what the late, great Albert Einstein said: doing the same thing over and over again and expecting a different result is the definition of insanity. We've got to be willing to do different to get different. Have a great week.